And it's just incredible how much promise psychedelics had even back then, and then how far they've regressed to the point that it's literally taken on the order of 50 or 60 years to get back to the point where people generally feel like there's promise in these substances. I'm Yuki, joined by my co-host Reggie, and you're listening to Modern Day Hippie, the podcast about doing drugs in a responsible, fun, and safe way to improve your life. Before we jump into today's episode, a quick legal disclaimer. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Our goal is to educate and inform others about the realities of substance use in an engaging format. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to attempt to recreate anything found in this episode or any of our other content. We are not confessing to any acts stated in this podcast. The content in this episode should not be treated as factual or real in any way. Now, with that, we hope you enjoyed today's show. Ladies and gentlemen, got another banger for y'all today. I'm going to be doing a live reaction to a YouTube video titled The Heroic Dose of Psychedelics. It's basically an interview / mini documentary of a Johns Hopkins professor who literally studies psychedelics and specializes in this stuff. So I'll be playing this video. It's about 10 or so minutes long, and I'll be pausing it and reacting to it on the spot. All right, here we go. Kicking off the video.
These experiences are often called ineffable, but as a scientist, I do my best to F it up by trying to describe it as much as I can. So I'll go ahead and do that.
I just want to start by pointing out that this professor looks exactly how you would expect someone who studies psychedelics to look. He's on the older side, but has this really crazy kind of all over the place beard and just a general like positive kind of fatherly, wholesome vibe. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see what he looks like. If you're not, you're missing out.
Our society has been in a mental health crisis, and it's been stagnating. A large portion of people treated with traditional antidepressants don't see benefit. Psychedelics are the only drug class that I know of where you have not just one or two, but lots of stories of people saying,
yeah, and before he gets into the stories, one of the things I want to highlight is the fact that the way that we treat not only mental health, but illnesses in general in the US and the West, but especially exacerbated in mental health, is the fact that we very much treat the symptoms and not the root causes of these issues. And speaking from my own experiences, the experiences of friends and family and people who I love around me, psychedelics are able to, in many cases, they're able to treat the actual root causes of these mental disorders and struggles that people are going through. I mean, you have people who are taking antidepressants for months or years at a time, and without those antidepressants, they're still struggling with that same mental health disorder. But we've seen examples with as little as a single dose of psychedelics markedly improving that patient's long-term life happiness and outlook and ultimate like recovery from that issue. You know, that ranges from things like depression and anxiety to things like alcoholism, PTSD, and things that can manifest even more viscerally.
They took this thing one time and they say it had this profound impact on the course of their entire life. They really exploded on the scene in the 1960s and were associated with some really radical changes to society that really scared.
Here, it sounds like he's going to go into a very brief history of psychedelics, how there's a lot of promise for them in the 60s, and then they got associated with counterculture movement, and everything basically went to shit. If you want to learn more about this in depth, check out microdose number 4. That's a little bit more of a deep dive into the history of psychedelics and what their come up looked like within the US in particular, how their downfall then happened, and now where that leaves us today.
A lot of people. I think now society is more ready to kind of accept these compounds and the whole picture of them. I'm Matt Johnson. I'm a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. I study drugs, principally psychedelics.
And the title of this interview is Why Psychedelics Are Having a Renaissance. This is something that we touch on pretty frequently in this podcast, the fact that there's this slow but steady wave building of interest and fascination and really concrete examples of how psychedelics in particular are able to help people across the board, whether it's people actively struggling with mental illnesses all the way to normal people who take them recreationally and report having significantly higher levels of just happiness and satisfaction with their lives.
It's hard to imagine a more interdisciplinary topic in the realm of drugs than psychedelics. They've apparently been used for time immemorial throughout many different cultures on the planet. Kary Mullis won the Nobel Prize inventing PCR, which revolutionized biology. He said he wouldn't have been able to do that had he not had experience in taking psychedelics.
First off, it is true that certain indigenous peoples have been utilizing naturally occurring psychedelics for hundreds and probably thousands of years in the past. And while the fact that people have been doing something for a long time is by no means evidence that we should continue doing it, the fact that these populations have been consuming these psychedelic substances in a way that clearly has not been negative enough to turn them off of psychedelics for such a long time, it's definitely, a small green flag in what I see as a large sea of green flags for psychedelics.
You move into the arts and then, who hasn't heard of musicians and other artists claiming that psychedelics had a profound impact on their creativity? There's the Beatles before LSD, and then there's the Beatles after LSD. That's a big shift. The initial big wave of that scientific interest for psychedelics was in the 1950s. So this was about a decade after Albert Hofmann had first discovered the psychoactive properties of LSD. There was a group in Maryland called the Spring Grove Group, a lot of early research there, particularly with cancer patients. But I would say one of the most important groups in the history of this work was led by Abram Halfer and Humphrey Osmond in Saskatchewan, Canada.
It honestly blows my mind that back in the 50s, which at this point is about 70 years ago, we were already experimenting with psychedelics for treating people who were just struggling with something big in their life. This conversation about the cancer patients. And it's just incredible how much promise psychedelics had even back then, and then how far they've regressed to the point that it's literally taken on the order of 50 or 60 years to get back to the point where people generally feel like there's promise in these substances. We came pretty far a very long time ago, like way before we had most of the technology and the things that we can take for granted in our lives now. And we were really kind of ahead of the curve. I can only imagine what it would have been like if psychedelics continued on that trajectory back in the 50s and the 60s and didn't go through all of the stigma and smear campaigns that were leveraged against these substances.
Canada, they were really the first group that I would say developed what we now call psychedelic therapy. There was this growing appreciation of some of the risks and the safeguards needed to minimize those risks, but not every investigator was aware of this. There was some unethical research, some wild research. There was controversy surrounding Timothy Leary, especially after he was fired from Harvard.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
Psychedelics became so associated with the counterculture. Society was, in a sense, traumatized. It all came to
be honest, I'm not super familiar with Timothy Leary or what he did within the context of psychedelics. Definitely something I'll look into and get back to you guys about. But I do appreciate that this guy brought up the fact that not all psychedelic experiences are necessarily positive. It's really not meant for absolutely everybody. I think for the average person, majority of the population, it will probably do some good to take small amounts of psychedelics. But there's definitely cases where it's not for everybody. And that's why these clinical trials, especially at these early stages, are very targeted and specific at the individuals that they actually allow into these trials. They really look for specific archetypes and types of people who are most likely to be receptive to these therapies without incurring any short-term or especially long-term negative effects.
To a halt. I mean, there were researchers that were running sessions and got the notices they just had to stop. The rug is pulled out for decades before there's a reinitiation. The research that's happening now, a lot of it is exploring medical applications. These are all drugs that can have a profound effect on one's sense of reality, including one's sense of self. I think kind of the only bet you can make is that if you have the dose high enough, something really interesting is going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you got that damn right. Whether it's positive, whether it's negative, it's going to be interesting. And it's also more likely than not going to be incredibly memorable. I mean, if I think back to the times when I tripped the hardest and ego death and lost my total sense of self, I still completely held on to my memories of those times. I never forgot anything, never had any semblance of what you'd call a blackout, which I experienced many times with alcohol. That's never happened to me on psychedelics, which is super interesting as well.
You might find yourself in your mind's eye, soaring in the heavens, the secrets of the universe seemingly revealed to you. On the other hand, 5 seconds later, it might collapse into what folks call a bad trip, where one could feel like they're going to die. It's sort of this like massive shakeup in one's experience of reality.
And for the record, I have been in that place of literally thinking I was going to die while I was on psychedelics. I'm happy to say that even right after that trip, I was aware of the fact that it would be something that I was going to get a lot of good out of and would be positive for me. And as even just days passed after that experience, I did become grateful that I had it, the empathy and the perspective that it helped me build and add to my life that I hadn't had before.
I'm floored when people with really substantial life experience will say things like, this was the most meaningful experience of their life. Compared to the intensity of the subjective effects, it's remarkable how little impact these substances have on physiology. You know, your heart rate, your blood pressure, everything has its risk, to be clear. But compared to other drug classes, psychedelics are really robustly safe at the physiological level.
This point in particular is one of the reasons why I love psychedelics so much, and they are far and away my favorite type of substance, is simply because they have virtually no negative effect on your physiology, on your biology, on your body. It is truly, in most cases, with most of these substances, just sequestered to your perception of reality and self. I mean, you're doing so much more damage to your body just in an act like drinking alcohol, and not even to talk about other drugs that people commonly take. I mean, truly, in many ways, psychedelics are like a magical form of medicine without having any negative effects on your body itself.
My therapeutic research with psychedelics has primarily used psilocybin, which is the agent in magic mushrooms. The dose we now give to patients is anywhere from 30 milligrams to 40 milligrams, which Terence McKenna, who's the famous psychedelic bard, would refer to repeatedly as the heroic dose. If a microdose is over here and a recreational dose is over here, we're way over here.
Yeah, so it kind of uses his arms there to point out, you know, on the right side you have a microdose. A little bit to the left of that, you have a recreational dose where you're feeling it, but you're still very operational. And then a good bit further left than that, you have this heroic dose where you really start losing touch with reality and self. And that's where you experience ego death.
When someone comes in for the day of their psychedelic session, they've already spent several hours with us on previous days preparing for the experience, developing that rapport. We know that all drugs are in part shaped by the context in which they're given, but for the psychedelic substances, that's particularly more so.
I do want to double down on what he said about prior conversations and preparation that a patient going through a psychedelic trial has with their doctor, their therapist, that team, whatever, and why I would never like actively recommend that anyone go out and try these things on their own. Obviously, exercise your own caution, like your actions are in your own hands. But it is important to remind even myself and all of us that when these substances are taken in controlled medical settings, there's a lot of preparation and pre-work that goes into this experience. Right now, that's all administered by these therapists. And I know when this actual work is being done in clinical trials, there has to be a minimum of 2 therapists in the room at all times when these are being done. Obviously, that's a pretty high barrier to entry. I mean, these therapists cost money, and there's a lot of work that goes into even preparing oneself for one of these experiences. There are some companies that I'm really excited about that are trying to create more self-serve digital experiences for preparing people to have their first psychedelic trip. And I'm really excited to see how those continue to pan out and build up over the coming years.
So when you provide it in more of a warm, welcoming situation, you tend to get more meaningful reactions to the substance.
So they just flashed on the screen the set and setting aspect of it. And it seems like he's implying that the set, which is the mindset, is very much kind of handled and taken care of in the work in the sessions leading up to the psychedelic experience. And then the setting is really creating a welcoming environment for the people. I mean, I have a friend who works for a company that does psychedelic clinical trials, and he thinks rather deeply about just the details of a room where someone's having this experience, everything from like the colors of the wall or the wallpaper, what objects are in the room and immediately in the patient's field of view. All this needs to be designed to create that optimal setting for ideally a positive experience.
When the experience unfolds, the person is going to lay down, wear eye shades and headphones through which music is played. So the idea is kind of get out of your normal everyday discursive, analyzing intellect.
Honestly, the eye shades and the noise-canceling headphones is pretty interesting. If I were to take a heavy dose and really deprive myself of sensations to that extent, I think I might be a little bit scared. But at the same time, when it's someone's first experience, it's very different from even their second, going on to their 20th, of course. And specifically because the first time that people do psychedelics, unless it's a really big dose, they might not be sure what they're feeling or what it's supposed to feel like. I know my first times on both shrooms and LSD, in hindsight, I definitely felt it, but in the moment, I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. And also I didn't want to just completely yeet myself over the edge with a heroic level dose. It was a good recreational dose. And so with a bigger kind of heroic-esque dose with that sensory deprivation, I imagine the need for therapists is especially important. I would honestly, in good faith, not recommend that to anyone for their first trip.
We really just encourage them to trust, let go, and be open. Trust the overall process. Going into this type of treatment is not easy at all. Trust yourself that you're robust. You're going to get through this experience. Let go.
On the trust portion, psychedelics are really often portrayed or cracked up as this fun adventure and trip and incredible experience. And honestly, they truly can be, but I do think it's even more important to approach these substances with respect and be aware that they can have really strong effects on you, and to respect that and, trust that that is going to happen to you, but also that you will be able to handle whatever it throws at you. There's a lot of, I think, just confidence and faith and ultimately trust that goes into having one of these experiences, especially for your first time. But even for me, after my 100th plus time of tripping, when I take a big dose, there are definitely times where I'm I need to trust myself. I need to be able to let go. And this recent time that I had a bad trip, I just wasn't able to do that fully. And that's okay, but it's a learning experience and, something that has enabled me to grow and have better experiences in the future. You're at the club and the music is thumping, but you've got nothing left in the tank. So what do? Sniff some cacao. Yup, you heard that right. Sniff some cacao. It's the hottest new trend in the club and party scene. One bum-sized sniff of raw chocolatey powder contains the caffeine equivalent to a half cup of coffee, and boom, it hits instantly.
And the best part is you can now sniff cacao anytime, anywhere, right out in the open, in front of the DJ booth or the stage, even at the VIP table with your friends. Now, how does that happen without drawing unwanted attention? Snogo's spring-loaded bump straws make it possible. These classy, triple mirror polished bump straws are the safest, most discreet way to enjoy sniffing cacao. In fact, you've most likely already seen people wearing Snogo's bump straws as pendants around their necks without even knowing it. Discover why sniffing cacao using Snogo bump straws is being called the biggest revolution in partying since the invention of rock and roll. Jump on over to snogostraws.com to learn more. That's SNOGOSTRAWS.com and use discount code MDH15 at checkout for 15% off your entire order.
What does let go mean? Let go means whatever your preconceived notions of what this experience might be or what experience you should have, don't let that get in the way for the experience that you will have. Don't try.
Yeah, freaking men to that. Again, those expectations that you're going to see rainbows and dragons and all these like crazy visuals in different realms. Honestly, if you go into it with that conception, you might honestly be a little bit disappointed, especially something like psilocybin. I know for me and a decent amount of my friends, it's rarely as much of a visual experience. It is very much just mental and introspective. For visuals, I've always had way more success with something like LSD. Whereas with shrooms, it's much more of kind of a mental and body experience for me. So it's important to temper those expectations. And honestly, it affects everyone differently. Like I know people who get pretty insane visuals from shrooms, and that just varies from one person to another.
To control it and be open. No matter where this takes you, go there. Whatever the experience is, take the orientation of, this is what I need to deal with. The range of experiences are just so broad. You can swing from a terrifying experience to this beatific, sort of like most amazing experience of your life. Some people could feel like they've reached the end of reality, this kind of plane of existence. Others say that they can feel the suffering across the entire planet, sort of having this sort of experience of universal empathy.
I really like the way that he portrayed this aspect of universal, all-knowing empathy. One of the coolest parts of psychedelics is the fact that they lower your ego to such an extent that you're barely aware of yourself, potentially not at all, but you become hyper aware of everything and all the people around you. And that's what really creates that sense of empathy with the people in your life, and honestly, humans all over the world who you may have never met in your life.
It's all welcome. The laughter, the tears, everything in between. That's exactly what this process is for. So the integration phase is where we're discussing the experience with them. And the themes that come up are so varied. One of the aspects you could call revealed truth. And I call these duh moments. These are experiences where people will feel like they've learned something at such a fundamental level. I think of examples in our...
I mean, these duh experiences, the first one that I think of for myself was when I decided to stop drinking alcohol. I mean, I was a really heavy drinker throughout all of college and a little bit after that. And when I had my trip where I decided to stop drinking, it came from the most logical place. It was like, this just makes sense. It's like, no shit, this is what is better for me and what I almost feel like, not that I'm like meant to do necessarily, but that my body and my brain ultimately want for me. It all just kind of made sense. And because it came from a place of logic and just having this like realized truth, as he puts it, it's a decision that literally I've never even thought to go back on. And I've heard stories of people having realizations like this across their whole gamut of experiences, realizations about their pasts, their current selves, where they want their futures to go, what they want out of their lives. It can truly vary so widely from person to person. That's one of the things that makes these substances so beautiful. It truly creates our own journeys for each of us. And even from one instance to another, it can vary so much between a trip you take today and one that you take a couple of weeks from now.
Our work we've done with cancer patients where, oftentimes people will say, I'm allowing this to create my own suffering. The cancer hasn't killed me yet. I can still live life, but I'm letting it do this to me. They knew it up.
I mean, that is like one hell of an example. I mean, you're giving someone who is potentially on the brink of dying a substance that makes them be at peace with that realization. I mean, that's unreal. Like, our prime directive as humans is to be alive, and like fearing death is probably one of the most common human instincts. And the fact that you can not turn that off, like, I think that's belittling the experience. The fact that you can embrace it and be okay with it is absolutely incredible. And that's not something that I have experienced, because luckily I haven't been in a situation where I am actually on the brink of death, but that is beautiful if you ask me.
Up here, they could tell you the words, but now they feel it in their bones, they feel it in their heart. People are reminded about this power they have to choose their own destiny. Some people come out of these sessions as participants and say that, 1 6-hour experience with psilocybin is like 1,000 hours of therapy.
To be honest, I don't even know if 1,000 hours of therapy could integrate these realizations that people have on psychedelics as deeply as one psychedelic trip. I mean, as you were saying, it's one thing to say words and think thoughts and really push yourself to believe them. It's another thing entirely to truly internalize them in your heart and every fiber of your being. And that's something that is just incredibly difficult and nearly impossible to do, I think, as a normal human with a lot of uncomfortable thoughts. But the fact that there's basically a shortcut or a hack for that is also just like mind-blowing. Like, that's crazy to me, man.
But one of the pitfalls of this clinical work is that you'd be hard-pressed to find a more intimate and vulnerable psychological intervention for a person. That's just a situation that is ripe for abuses if we don't have the right safeguards. Because of that vulnerability, because of the incredible gravity of these sessions, we need to even more tenaciously cling to clinical boundaries. We need to.
So an example of this is that actually one of the reasons why there needs to be at least 2 therapists in the room at any given time during a psychedelic experience is because there have been stories of therapists and patients essentially like falling in love or hooking up or whatever, like during or after, as a result of one of these sessions. And the idea is to decrease that possibility and, not allow a one-off experience like this to really create something that, like just shouldn't happen in a medical and like therapist patient context.
To limit the use of therapeutic touch. A subtler form of abuse is just filling in the blanks for people. I call it the guru complex. People often confront big picture questions. What is the meaning of life? Does God exist? What's the big picture of everything that's going on? What am I? On those metaphysical questions, we really have to be silent.
That last statement or two is probably my favorite part of this video, because a lot of times when we're tripping, especially with other friends, we might feel like we're completing each other's sentences or like on the same vibe. And honestly, that's one of the best parts of having these experiences with friends or people who you care about around you. But also this realization that you don't want to accidentally plant an idea in someone's head or vice versa, because you really don't know what the butterfly effects of that could be. And you can also turn that around and put that realization on yourself. Like, you might be asking yourself these big picture, existential, metaphysical questions when you're in one of these experiences. You will probably have the urge to ask it or talk about it with a friend. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But also consider how you might just sit with that question and try to think it through on your own without anyone else's input.
In the biggest picture, Aside from psychedelics' ability to treat one disorder or another, I think they're just poised to really help us to understand the nature of psychiatric disorders.
This part's also incredibly interesting because there's so much about psychiatric disorders that we just don't know and don't understand. The way that basically all of these disorders are diagnosed is through just a checklist of symptoms and factors in this big book that lists out all these different disorders. And that's something that's been refined over decades of clinical work and trial and error, and tens of thousands, probably way more people than that have like gone through these processes of being diagnosed. But there's very little that we understand at the actual biological and physiological level.
Commonalities do they have with each other that are somehow being addressed by psychedelic treatment? I kind of think of all of these disorders as different forms of addiction. So whether it's to a substance like tobacco or alcohol, cocaine, or a way of thinking about yourself, it's this narrowed mental and behavioral repertoire. Reality used to be like this, and now your reality is like this. And
I'm not sure how much I agree with the statement that everything is an addiction to something. I'm sure if you stretch that, I could be made to agree with it, and that may be true in some ways. But at the same time, I think it can be a little bit reductive to talk about, especially some of these more intense mental disorders, as purely addictions. Again, there's a lot going on there that we simply don't understand and just are very far away from having the capability to understand at this point.
psychedelics, when done well in the right setting, had the ability to just blow people out of that narrowed story. It holds a lot of promise in helping us figure out what it takes for the human being to be mentally healthy.
So that's the end of the video. Honestly, I really like this video overall. It does a good job of succinctly summarizing kind of the history of psychedelics and a lot of the promise and potential that we see in them now. This is a video that I would use to share with a friend or a family member who is maybe curious about these substances, but wants to learn from a more, trusted and an academic source. So definitely keep this one in your repertoire in case you ever want to send it to a friend or a family member who is just curious about this world of new medicine and development. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you're listening on podcast, the link to this YouTube video will be in the description below, so check that out. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to leave a like on the video if you're on YouTube, or just take a second to follow and leave a rating for the podcast. It goes a really long way in helping us out. That's the pod. Truly, thank you for listening to the show. We seriously fucking appreciate it. If you want to help us out, just leaving a rating or a comment, the drill, would be incredibly helpful. But more importantly, share the knowledge and the love with your friends. Make sure they're getting the information they need on this topic that is so underserved and underappreciated in today's society. We'll see y'all next week.